Well, hi there folks, how are we doing today? Great to see you. You can still see the marks today of where the very first folks laid the first stones, and I remember digging out a black and white photograph from old newspapers, and it actually is showing just up behind us here somewhere. I've been able to figure out the exact stone where a time capsule was laid for us to dig out one day. And I remember thinking, well, it's nearly 100 years since this place was built. That'll be in 2029, which is not that far away, albeit March just there feels like it was about 16 years ago. But I guess we've got to think about the hopes and dreams for our place, what God's vision is for us, what kind of community do we want to be. Well, Nehemiah is all about hopes and dreams and visions and building community. So let's go inside and let's continue the story today. Well, when you first read Nehemiah chapter 3, It just looks as if it's a long list, a detailed list of loads of names and sections of wall. And it's true, it is like that, but there's much more than that going on. It's about a community that we're told had been in disgrace, but it's recovering hope. It's got a vision, there's a plan here, and a rebuilding things. And it's the rebuilding of people's lives that's going on here in Nehemiah. I don't know if you've ever seen a program called The Repair Shop. It's an absolutely fascinating program. I love it. It's where people find an old family heirloom. Maybe it's broken or not working anymore, or they've discovered something maybe in their garage or up in the loft and it's gathered dust. And they bring it along, and these experts there, these craftspeople who with their expert hands take it and they take off all the grime or the dust that's gathered over the years. They replace broken parts and they get it working again. They breathe new life back into it. And when the owners come back and see it after all this work has been done, they're usually overwhelmed with emotion, filled with joy, because it's not just that it's working again, it's that there's a story behind it. Something has been recovered, something has been restored. And there's something of that going on here in Nehemiah. This is about a community being rebuilt again. This is about people being rebuilt again, and they've got names. And their names are recorded here because they have real stories behind them. And you have a story for you as well, your story. And God knows you by name, and He's involved in your life, rebuilding and restoring things again. It says in Hosea, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He will heal us. He will bind us up." Jesus said He came to bind up the brokenhearted. It says in Jeremiah, "I will restore you, and your city will be rebuilt on her ruins." This is about rebuilding and restoring things, and restoring community and dignity and esteem and hope and all of those things. It says in 1 Peter 2, "As you come to Him, the living stone, you're like living stones. You're being built into a spiritual house." In the Message paraphrase, it puts it this way. It says, "Welcome to the living stone, the source of life. The workman took one look and threw it out, but God set it in the place of honor. Present yourselves as building stones for the construction of a sanctuary vibrant with life, in which you'll serve as holy priests, offering Christ-approved lives up to God." Present yourselves as building stones, living stones. That's what you are. And stone by stone, person by person, story by story, God is at work in our life, restoring us, recovering what was lost, binding up the brokenhearted. That's the real message, the real story of what's going on in the book of Nehemiah. So the people had said, "Let us start rebuilding," and they all get involved in this work of rebuilding community. It's interesting when you read certain sections. Verse 23, for example, says, "Beyond them, Benjamin and Hashub made repairs in front of their house, and next to them, Azariah, son of Maaseiah, son of Ananiah, made repairs beside his house." And there's lots of mentions of houses and people making the repairs just outside their front door. And quite often Christian spirituality begins right there, in our own heart, in our own home, just outside our front door with our neighbours, before we go anywhere else. It's interesting, there's so many lessons in the Old and the New Testament about loving our neighbour and loving those that we live with. So there's household codes, for example, in the New Testament that speak about masters and slaves and husbands and wives and parents and children. 1 Peter 3, for example, says, "All of you live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic be loving and compassionate and humble. That's the kind of people we're to be, and it starts right here, and it starts in our own home. It's not just about when we go to church, not that any of us are really going to a church building quite yet at the moment, but it's not as if we're just in church mode, if you like. It's all the time. It's a spirituality that fills us all the time. Jesus' teaching in the Beatitudes, of course, was so key to this. He said, you've heard it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He taught us to love our neighbour. He says, when you give to the needy, when you're praying, when you're fasting, don't do it for show for other folks. Close the door. Do it in secret. That's where true Christian spirituality begins, from the heart, a relationship with God, and it works its way out into the home, how we treat people. Often in the New Testament, when we're reading qualifications for leadership, yes, gifts and talents and abilities are all important, but it's how does this person get on at home? How do they treat those around them? What kind of a person are they? And here in Nehemiah, with this work of building, quite often the work was going on right outside folks' homes. It's where they began. And if they were wondering, well, where do we start? Nehemiah was saying, you can start right there. I suppose often we wonder, what is God calling me to do? Where is he calling me to go? And some of us are called to go and go further afield, and we must be obedient to that. But all of us are called to go, in a sense. And as we go forward and through life, we're to show love and to love our neighbour and love those around us and love God in our own heart. I suppose if we're wondering, what should we do for God? Where should we go? Nehemiah says, you can start right at home, right where you are, wherever you are. That circle of people around you might be your workplace, it might be colleagues, it'll be neighbours, those outside your front door. For a lot of people here, their work began right outside their front door. And that's where the work of rebuilding began. It's a work of building the kingdom and doing what God is calling us to do. In Isaiah, in chapter 58 and verse 12, a verse that's so relevant for this and for us, it says, your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. It's about community, it's about life and health and hope. And you can play a part in that right where you are. Who is God calling you to reach out to today? So the people here are rebuilding the walls and rebuilding community, and everybody is playing a part. And for some folks, that meant building a section right outside their very own house. I guess that was actually a pretty good thing to do and a pretty good bit of planning on Nehemiah's part, if you think about it. If you were rebuilding a wall right around the whole city for security and such like, you wouldn't want there to be a massive gap right outside your very own house. In fact, you wouldn't want it to be a weak spot either. It's quite good for accountability. And I suppose in that sense, when everybody does their bit, everybody benefits. It's not as if a few should do all of the work, although that can happen in church life where a small group do most of the work. It shouldn't really be that way. When the team works, the dream works, I suppose you could say. There's a shared plan and a shared vision, and everybody's getting involved here. Although, amazingly, I say everybody, in verse 5, read this, the next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. I mean, what? The nobles of Tekoa wouldn't do it. It's not as if they were lazy. It said they wouldn't humble themselves. They thought it was beneath them. They wouldn't work under the supervision of anybody. They didn't want to do this hard task of rebuilding the walls, and that certainly shouldn't be the way. It is interesting, though, that as leaders and as nobles, they were in a leadership position, but it's noted here that they weren't pulling their weight, and it's noted down. We're always being watched in that sense as leaders, and we're always to be accountable for what we do. Although, interestingly, the folks of Tekoa, they actually did it. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, where they actually did it. And in fact, later on in verse 27, next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section from the great projecting tower to the wall of Ophel. So they actually went that extra mile. And I suppose when some folks don't do their work, others have to do a bit of a double shift. We often know that as well. But here these men of Tekoa really do get stuck in and are doing a lot. And the priests as well, they're working here as well, and they set a really great example for others. They're the first to be mentioned in getting stuck in and doing work. And we're told in verse 22, the repairs next to him were made by the priests from the surrounding region, so even others come and get involved. And all kinds of folks are getting involved here, all kinds of different folks. They're not listed as professional builders. There's loads of different kinds of folks, so there's no sacred secular split here. The priests and everybody else are getting involved in the work. There's no gender split either. This is men and women getting involved in the work. Verse 12, Shalom, we're told, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. There's no sacred secular split in the work of the kingdom and the building going on here. There's no gender split in the work going on. There's no kind of class distinction going on here. Everybody's doing it. The men of Tekoa are getting involved. We're told towards the end there's craftsmen, merchants, there are goldsmiths. And my favourite verse of all, in fact it's one of my favourite verses in the whole Bible, it just strikes me. In verse 8, we're told that Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs as well. The perfume makers were getting involved in rebuilding the wall. I don't know what the perfume makers were really like. I suspect that having to source materials and travel to get them, raw materials for their craft, they were probably quite hardy travellers, good negotiators as well, skilled people with their hands, and important in that society for temple worship and incense, for embalming the dead as well, in a very hot and dusty environment like that, also keeping sweet smelling aromas around. So really important folks, but even they are getting involved in the rebuilding of the walls. This is for everybody. And the work of the kingdom is for everybody. Everybody is invited into the kingdom. Priest or otherwise, goldsmith, daughter, perfume maker. The kingdom is open. Everybody's invited. Everybody's welcome. And everyone can play a part. And that includes, of course, you too. So the people are involved in the work of rebuilding, and they're all playing a part, section by section. It begins at the sheep gate, and we get all of these details of sections of walls and different gates, and it goes all the way around to the end of the chapter, ending at the sheep gate again, going all the way around the wall. And it would have been hard work, lots of broken fingernails, blood, sweat and tears, and all of that hard physical labour. But they were doing it for God, and there was something of God going on here. It's no mistake that at the very beginning of the chapter, we're told that it was the high priest and his fellow priests who went to work, rebuilding the sheep gate, and they dedicated it at the end. It's not that they dedicated it to the city or to Nehemiah or to get a building certificate. No, they were dedicating it to the Lord, because they were doing this for him. This was their act of worship. Even though it was hard physical labour, the building of a wall even. Colossians 3:17 says this: whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Whatever you do, whether it's at the desk, at the workplace, at home, with family, friends, in the neighbourhood community, whatever you're doing, do it for the glory of God. And remember that story of the repair shop? We were thinking earlier about repairing things and restoring things. Well, there's an interesting word used very often in this chapter, because not every part had to be rebuilt completely from scratch. It's the word for repairing things, and we do read that. So in verse 3 we hear about rebuilding, but in verse 4 it says that Meremoth repaired the next section, and next to him Meshullam, he made repairs. Next to him, now Zadok, son of Bana, he also made repairs. The Valley Gate, verse 13, was repaired. They also repaired 500 yards of the wall. And so it goes on like that. This word repair, time and time again. And it's a word for being made whole again, being built up, being restored. It's a word that can also mean to strengthen, to encourage, and to heal. And there's something of that going on. We know that God said to us, he came to bind up the broken-hearted, and that was his ministry in so many ways among us. We read in Luke chapter 4, for example, when Jesus stood up to begin his public ministry, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." This is about the binding up of the brokenhearted, restoring what was lost, and that's what he does in your life. There's a Japanese craft, a trade. I'm going to have to look at the word here because I don't fully understand it or know how to pronounce it. It's kintsugi. Apologies for the mispronunciation. Kintsugi, golden repair anyway. It's where a vase, a vessel, a bowl, something like that is broken or it's got a crack in it. And rather than putting some ugly metal staples in to try and get it back together again, it's about filling it in a beautiful way, binding it together again, sometimes with powdered gold to make it look beautiful. And it's about recovering what could have been lost, embracing brokenness, accepting change, continuing a story of wholeness, and actually making something strong again, making it beautiful again. Well, that's what is going on here in Nehemiah. It's about a community being restored and people being restored, living stone by living stone. And that's what God has come to do in your life as well. Jesus said, "I have come that you might have life and know it to the full." He said, "See, I am making everything new." And that's what he wants to do in your life. Restoration, recovery, binding up the brokenness, healing the wounds, making us whole again. Why don't you let him do that work in your life, beginning even today? Well, may Jesus bind up your broken heart. May he be at work within you to redeem and restore. May it be a work of grace and love and a new story, one that makes you stronger and even more beautiful. And all the while, may we give him glory for this loving Lord that we have, who does this amazing work in our life, who makes everything new. And as we serve him, whatever we do, may we give him the glory today and always. Amen.